I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We have finally got to lesson number 8. I think we've been in lesson 7 all summer. And we have finally got to lesson 8. And this lesson won't be quite as long because we're only going to be covering basically about 175 years in this lesson. And in lesson 9, I think we're going to be covering a period of almost 1,000 years. Because in the Dark Ages there was some error that was taught, but we're not going to go into all of the history, the secular history that went on there, because a lot of what happened in the Dark Ages is more secular history. The Roman Empire fell, or at least the western half of the Roman Empire fell. The Catholic Church became not only the religious head of Western Europe, but it almost became basically the state head. You couldn't be a king in Europe without pledging allegiance to the Pope. And so that happened for almost 1,000 years. And so that was, there are some interesting times in the Dark Ages that we will cover. Some error that was propagated during that time, but that's a period of about 1,000 years, which will bring us to the Reformation, which will be lesson 10 of the series. And we'll go through the Reformation. Then we get into why are there so many churches. We so far have dealt with the Church of the Bible. We've sort of seen that church digress off into error, but it's not going to be replaced by 1,000 churches. It's going to be replaced by, well, it will continue, but I mean it will be largely overrun by the Catholic Church. And so that's what we have to look forward to. And this lesson is called the Council of Nicaea Through the 5th Century. And so the Council of Nicaea, why did we break? Why was lesson 7 dealing with 225 years? Why 325 AD? It's not the beginning of a century. Usually you might think, oh, well, you break at the end of a century. No, the Council of Nicaea is perhaps the council that cemented the apostasy that had been creeping in to the organization of the church. Remember, in the Bible, how did the church discern truth? In the Bible.
By the Bible.
By the Bible. Word of God. That's what the brethren did in Acts 15. It wasn't a council of Jerusalem. People gathered together to determine what the will of the Lord was. And they used Old Testament scripture. They used the miraculous power that God had given the apostles. They did not create their own doctrine. After the end of the 1st century, councils, churches each were supposed to be autonomous, separate from each other. Even though there were Christians in many cities, I try to tell people, even though there are Christians in many cities, then and now, we are not members of the same local church. That doesn't mean we're enemies with brethren who are in other local churches. But if we are going to be members of one local church, we're members of the local church we decide to be members of. And the issues of a congregation remain in the congregation. The church does a work in the area that it is in. It doesn't go and meddle in the affairs of another congregation. Well, that started happening at the end of the 1st century. Churches stopped being autonomous. They had elders, instead of overseeing one congregation, oversaw congregations in cities and in provinces. And then we had problems. Well, it happens today. What happens when someone believes something different? Well, a lot of times we say, we'll go to the Bible, let's determine what that is. Sometimes that doesn't work. And so the idea was, okay, let's have councils. The councils of the elders will decide what doctrine is. And we had many of those councils, but what makes the Council of Nicaea different than those other councils? When we talked about some of the councils before, they were what I might call regional councils. And what we're going to find is only some churches gathered together in those councils. So in other words, it's sort of like if the Catholics decided, well, we're going to have a Council of Toronto. Well, they're not going to invite all of the churches from the entire world to come to Toronto. They might only invite the Catholic churches in the region of Toronto, maybe some from New York, Ohio, Ontario, Quebec. Like as far as, it's not a worldwide council. What Nicaea was an ecumenical council. And it was the first ecumenical council. And ecumenical just means all accepting. Like we use the word, we don't think of the word in the context of a council, but ecumenical just means accepting all. And what this was all the bishops from all the churches were called to be part of it. And we know not every bishop attended. There were still churches that wouldn't have attended these councils, but even the ones that did, not every bishop attended. And in that council, canon law, canon means law, like as far as canon law was decreed here, which every faithful church must follow at the risk of the entire church being excommunicated. We don't read of a church being withdrawn from by another church. We read of members within a church being withdrawn from. But we do not read of churches withdrawing from other churches. Now, that doesn't mean I would go worship just at any church I feel like. I'm going to worship where I believe I can worship God in spirit and in truth. But if a church, pretend, we'll use us as an example. If we went back, the church at West End would not have to withdraw from us. Now, they might know that we have gone bad. We've stopped teaching truth. But that doesn't mean that they withdraw from us, because there's nothing to withdraw from. We are not connected. Christians withdraw from those who are among them. That's the whole idea. The whole idea is not as a form of punishment to shun them. It's a way of getting them to come back. How can you withdraw from someone that you don't ever have fellowship with in the first place? And so, but with these churches, since they were all now connected in some way, well, you're not going to follow the doctrine? Oh, you're no longer a faithful church. And so the council was held in Nicaea, which is present-day Iznik, Turkey. That's in northwestern Turkey near Istanbul, which at that time was known as Constantinople. And so that's my introduction. So the historical background, what we need to know why this council was. So remember, we had two rulers of the Roman Empire at that time. We have Constantine, he ruled the Western Empire. And then we have Licinius, he was the ruler of the eastern portion of the empire, basically everything east of Greece and east, whereas Rome was just west of Greece and over into Europe. And so Licinius here, he befriended a man named Cineas, who had plotted against Constantine's life. Well, how do you think Constantine would have taken that? Probably like you'd expect.
Not very likely.
Probably like you'd expect. This agreement, Licinius turned to paganism, and the fact that he befriended one of Constantine's enemies, he got Constantine pretty mad. And so he gathered his forces and marched against Licinius to Adrianople. That's what the city was called then. Adrianople. Now Constantine, I sort of boil this down. This didn't take place overnight. As far as this is over a period of probably about 5 to 10 years. But Constantine eventually won. But as we find if we study European history, how did royal families typically make peace? Anyone know?
They married each other.
That's how they made peace. You're not gonna kill your sister's husband, or you're not gonna kill your brother's wife's family, because you're all married to each other. And so the Europeans were famous for it, and that's how they made peace. Well, that's how Constantinople and Licinius made peace, because Constantinople's Constantine's sister was Licinius' wife. And so, out of respect for her, he didn't kill Licinius, even though he defeated him. But he did change the name of Adrianople to Constantinople, and he moved the capital of the Empire of Rome to here, or to the Roman Empire to here. It had been in Rome for almost now 400 years. And yet now it's in Constantinople. And the reason why I put it down on the page is that is important. Because when we have the split in the Catholic Church between the Catholics and the Orthodox, it's all going to come down to who is superior, the Bishop of Rome or the Bishop of Constantinople. And those two cities are going to be major cities. And they affect the Catholic Church because church and state are now very much intertwined. And so, for a short period of time, the Roman Empire was again united. Because remember, it had split into two. And it split into the Eastern and the Western Empire. For a short time, while Constantine was still alive, it was united, although it would split again. Council of Nicaea was called because, as I said before, there was some controversy. There was a guy who believed something different. And what this is known as was the Arian controversy. And it's named after the guy. It has nothing to do with anything about the doctrine itself. It was named after the man who proposed it. And basically, this teaching was about the deity of Christ. Was Christ God? Was he man? Was he a mixture between God and man? Was he created? Was he eternal? That's what was being discussed. And so Arius, he was a presbyter, or an elder of Alexandria. Now, let's remember, were the elders in the apostate church, were the elders, the overseers, are the same as bishops? We'll say that. Were the elders the same as bishops in the apostate church? They were lower. They were lower. So, in other words, we had a hierarchy. Remember, we had the elders who were supposed to be the overseers of the entire flock. There wasn't to be a rank among elders in the Bible. But there quickly became one. Remember, we had the elders, and we had the bishop. And he was over the entire eldership. Well, Arius, he was an elder of Alexandria. He was not the bishop. He taught the doctrine that Christ was a created being, the first of all God's creation, and the being by whom all other beings were created. So in other words, he came along and says, well, the Bible only says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't tell us much about what was before the beginning. A lot of people like to speculate. Well, what was God doing before he created heaven and earth? That makes a great philosophical question. But we have no idea about anything that God doesn't reveal to us. But this guy named Arius, he was saying, well, before God created the heavens and the earth, he created Jesus, the guy, Christ, the man we call Jesus. He created this being. And he used that being to create everything else. Because Hebrews is undeniable that Christ was the one through whom he made the worlds. Now, people don't come up with, generally speaking, people don't come up with doctrines without biblical support for them. Because if a doctrine doesn't have, if you can't turn to a verse in the Bible that might look like it teaches something, that doctrine quickly falls apart by people who claim that the Bible is the Word of God. So let's go to some verses that look like might teach what this guy wants. In Isaiah chapter 46, we'll start with Naomi. Isaiah 46 and verse 9.
Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me.
All right. What's this verse telling us about God?
Well, it makes it sound like he's alone.
Makes it sound like he's alone. I am God, and there is no other. But, let's back up to verse 1 of Isaiah 46. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols were on the beasts and on the cattle. Your carriages were heavily loaded, a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but have themselves gone into captivity. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been upheld by me from birth, who have been carried from the womb, even to your old age. I am he, and even to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear you, even I will carry, and will deliver you. To whom will you liken me, and make equal and compare me, that we should be alike? They lavish gold out of the bag, weigh silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith, and he makes it a god. They prostrate themselves, yes, they worship. They bear it on the shoulder, they carry it and set it in its place, and it stands. From its place it shall not move. The one cries out to it, yet it cannot answer, nor save him out of his trouble. Remember this, and show yourselves men. Recall to mind, O you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. Listen to me, you stubborn-hearted, you who are far from righteousness. I bring my righteousness near, it shall not be far off. My salvation shall not linger, and I will place salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. What's this chapter talking about? What had Israel done?
Worshipping idols.
They were worshiping idols. He's saying, you bow down to these things. You bought the materials to make it. You brought it to the goldsmith and the silversmith. They made you an image and you bow down to it. Does the image do you any good? No, you made it. It says, I am God, there is none like me. We sometimes sing a song that comes from this section of Isaiah. There is none like me. None can compare. No God is equal. No prince is heir. God is not like these images. He is much above that. This passage, when you just take verse 9, says, I am God, there is none like, there is no other. Tammy said it makes it sound like God's alone. Like there's only one being of God, like as far as that God the Father is God, and there is no other. But in the context, remember, we're not talking about the persons of the Godhead here. We're comparing it to idolatry. There are many idols. There is one God. It speaks nothing to the Godhead. Nothing about the Holy Spirit, nothing about Jesus Christ, nothing really about God the Father. They are all God, and they are one. So, this verse on its face looks like maybe it teaches that. But, another verse, I'll go to Tammy, Psalms chapter 2, verse 7.
I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you.
What does the word begotten mean in the Bible? Think about the Genesis. We read of beget or begotten. I'm not saying what does this mean, I'm saying what does the word usually mean.
Well, usually means something God has done.
Yeah, it could mean that. When in relation to humans, though,
It's usually a parent of.
should parent to child.
So-and-so.
So-and-so beget this. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Reuben and Judah and all his brethren. Judah begat so-and-so and all the way down. You just read genealogies, Genesis chapter 5. Read Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 3. And you find this word beget. And so in Psalms 2, in verse 7, it says, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And so in other words, this verse looks like, oh well, whoever is being talked about here, we believe it's messianic because the New Testament is going to tell us it is. But it's going to take a look. Looks like Jesus is born. In other words, God created him, as Bill was saying. Something that God has done. We don't have to wonder what this verse means, though. Because, and if you were in the Saturday class, we've already covered this, but in Acts chapter 13, verses 29 to 37. We get an inspired commentary of what this verse means. We're going to start with Bill. We'll do 2 verses each. Acts 13, beginning at verse 29.
When they had carried out all that was written concerning him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead. Is that what you want?
Yeah. Come across to Henry.
And for many days, he was seen by those who have And for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. But now he's witness to the people, and we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers.
This he has fulfilled to us and chosen by grace Jesus as also it is great in the second sons. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. And as for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no more to make corruption. He has spoken in this way. I will give you the holy and sure innocence of that.
Therefore he also says in another psalm, You will not allow your Holy One to see corruption. For David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep, was buried with his fathers, and saw corruption. But he hoped God raised up saw no corruption.
All right. So, Paul here is speaking, and he is in the city of, let's see, I think he's in Antioch, in the city here, if I remember from my Saturday class. But he's preaching in synagogue on Sabbath day, preaching to the Jews. He's giving them a little bit of a history lesson, and he quotes the second psalm here. In what context has he quoted that psalm? What's he talking about when he quotes that psalm?
The resurrection.
Resurrection. He had just finished saying, God has fulfilled this for us in that he has raised up Jesus, as it is also written in the second psalm, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Now we understand what David was saying all the way back in Psalms 2. Begotten doesn't mean created, as in being born that never to existed. It does mean born. It is the firstborn from the dead, the first to be raised, never to die again. That's how Jesus is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That is how he is begotten of the Father. It's not that God created him. It's that God raised him from the dead. That's what that word means. But when you only read certain scriptures and you discount other scriptures or forget that they exist, that's how you wind up with false doctrine. It's not that sometimes we forget what scriptures say. People can misspeak. But remember, there were people at that time. The Bible, we think, the people didn't have the Bible. Well, churches had the scriptures. Where do you think the Catholics came up with things that, the books that they want to claim how they gave us the Bible? They existed at that time. Churches had them. They didn't create something that the churches had to sort of wonder, well, is this really the Word of God? No, they had it, and the Catholics just came along and decreed that whatever the churches had, that we're going to accept that as the Word of God. But the church has had it. And you could read Psalms 2 and you could read Acts 13. People had both. And so this man Arius here, he was teaching error. And because he was teaching error, the bishop of Alexandria, I will give him credit, recognized that Arius was teaching error, and he deposed him. He got rid of him. So this is error. This is heresy. But, all right, you get deposed by one congregation, you go to another. And he found friends. He found people who were agreeing with him. And because these churches were so interconnected, doctrine, false doctrine, could spread quickly. And so the controversy spread and threatened to destroy the peace of the church. Remember, Christianity had only, 15 years earlier, been legalized in the Roman Empire. For 200 years, Christianity had been persecuted. Almost 250 years. Christianity had been persecuted. And now was supposed to be a time of relative peace coming from Constantine, because it was now legal to be a Christian. And now they find places to fight. They had no room to fight amongst each other because they were too busy trying not to be killed. Now that there's peace, now we find division. And that's the danger of a lack of church autonomy. People want to know, what? I don't like some of the things that brethren are doing. It's not because I think they're sinful. I don't believe many of the camps are sinful. I do not believe some of the classes that the ladies and the men have are sinful. I know the people running them now. But just because I know the men and the women who are in them doesn't guarantee that everything that person says is true. As long as they're teaching truth, there's really no problems. Everyone's growing in the Bible. But when false doctrine is being taught, maybe the kids especially aren't going to know the difference, like the adults might. And so we're exposing that. The kids might learn something. They'll come home to the congregation where their parents are members, and in Bible classes they may not come up in Bible classes, but the kids grow up, they become Christians, and eventually they're going to become the people who are going to be molded to be leaders and overseers of the congregation. And what you learn from a young person, typically you bring into older life. It's hard to get rid of things you've been taught as a young person, even if, especially when they're error, but even when you don't know that they're error. And so, by having all of the young people from an area in one place, it's so much easier for false doctrine to spread into many congregations if we're not careful. And so that's just the danger. The congregation, people say, well, there's not a lot of young people where I'm a member of. It's good for kids. Well, it's good for kids to be social with other Christians. And for them to have good role models, yes. But the congregation that we're members of needs to find ways to include the kids. They always expect the preacher to do everything. That's going to be a problem because the preacher's not going to be able to do everything. But if we want to get the kids involved, let's find things for them to do. Talk to other members. Remember, that's the whole beauty of Christ's church is we're not ruled by other congregations. We don't have to wait for other people to take the initiative. If you want to have a Bible study, have a Bible study. If you want to get the kids together to do something, get the kids together to do something. Take the initiative. And it will be done. If we're waiting for a group of people or a preacher to do something, we're going to be waiting a while because everyone gets busy. And so take the initiative, and the kids will learn. But everyone's got to be involved. This is, though, a danger. This type of error here, the deity of Christ is a danger because of autonomy. had broken down. And so we have this Council of Nicaea in 325. It was convened by Constantine, the emperor himself. Was the emperor, do we read of an emperor in the Bible being any position in the church? King, an emperor, anything like that? No. That he had power. Because of course he had money. Whoever has money seems to always have power. You control the money, you can control people. Constantine had money. He was bankrolling the building of these church buildings and these cathedrals, and you didn't want to anger Constantine. If Constantine wanted a council, he got a council. And he called the bishops, he wanted peace. He called the bishops to this ecumenical council. And so depending on who's counting, there were 318 bishops assembled from all parts of the world to consider the doctrine of Arius and other controversial matters. They met for 67 days. And if you've ever seen how they select a pope, they have what's called a conclave, which means they're shut off from all the world until a new pope is selected. The cardinals are. Well, that's what this was. This council wasn't, okay, we meet for a few hours a day, then we go out shopping and stay in nice hotels. No. They were secluded for 67 days while they had this meeting. It's in Nicaea. I don't know whether it's in what type of building it's in, but they were conclave. They were secluded for 67 days to make a decision that would govern the church on the nature of Christ. Wow, that's quite arrogant for man to come along and think in 67 days that we will decide whether Christ is God. Now we will discern whether Christ is God. No, we will decide whether Christ is God. We have legislation here that God has not legislated and a procedure for which there is no authority. Come up to, actually go to Sandy. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16. So 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16. Paul here is talking about earthly wisdom, how it contrasts to the wisdom from above that comes through the Spirit. Who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? That's a quote from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 13. Paul's quoting Isaiah here, who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him. Man becomes pretty arrogant to think that we can determine things that God hasn't revealed to us. There are a lot of things about the nature of Christ that I don't understand. About the nature of God, Holy Spirit. I can know what God has revealed to me by His Spirit. But I can't know things that God hasn't revealed, and I don't get to decide for God what things about God I believe. That's just the height of arrogance to think that we can legislate about who Jesus is. That we can decide whether Jesus is God or Jesus isn't God. It wasn't guaranteed to come out of this council that Jesus was God. It's amazing. God the Father's in heaven taking a look down and going, well, I guess Jesus, you're on the chopping block right now. Are you God or not? That's very arrogant. Billy, you had something.
I just thought where it says, but we have the mind of Christ, like Christ's example always was, he just did as the Father instructed him. He didn't there's no case of where Christ argued and, well, maybe my way's better. Like,
Yeah.
he just simply done it. Even though
Yeah.
he was God, that's the example to us.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so the council was presided over by Constantine, and the deliberations of the council were directed towards the doctrine of Arius, that Christ was not equal to the Father or the same substance, which means he wasn't deity, he wasn't God. And so you had Arius on one side, and you had a deacon of the church in Alexandria, Athanasius. He was a deacon, and he led the other side of the argument. And his party eventually prevailed. Arius and two of his friends were thus banished to Aurelia, which is in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, and Croatia, and that region, while the others who held this doctrine were deposed from their positions as bishops or elders or whatever they were. And so Christ was God. That's what came out of this council. And what we have that we'll deal with next week, the Lord willing, is the Nicene Creed. That's what comes out of this council as the beliefs that the church has. And so, on your own time, maybe this week, you can read, I have the entire creed written down. We will read it next week, the Lord willing, and discuss what might be true in what we read, where there might be error, and why we don't need it to begin with.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to